In most of the world, a grave is forever, a place where a body can rest, undisturbed, for centuries. But in one of the wealthiest cities on Earth, the dead are given a strict deadline: 6 years. After that, their bones are dug back out of the ground, boiled clean, cremated, and their plot is handed over to someone else who has just died. This is not some ancient, forgotten ritual. It is standard practice today, in 2026, in Hong Kong. So how did one of the most modern cities on the planet end up running its cemeteries, like a hotel with a strict checkout policy? To understand that, you have to understand a much bigger problem. Hong Kong simply never had enough land, not even enough for its dead. Hong Kong is one of the most densely populated territories on Earth. Over 7.5 million people are packed into just over 100 square kilometers, and more than 3/4 of that land is mountainous, protected, or simply too steep to build on. For the living, this has already produced some of the most expensive real estate on the planet: tiny, subdivided apartments and entire neighborhoods stacked vertically into the sky. But there is a second, quieter housing crisis unfolding in Hong Kong, one that almost nobody outside the city ever thinks about: a housing crisis for the dead. The roots of this crisis trace back to Hong Kong's transformation under British colonial rule in the 19th century. What had once been a scattering of fishing villages exploded into a trading hub, and later, a global financial capital packed onto a peninsula and a handful of islands. As the population surged across the 20th century, city planners faced an impossible equation. Every hectare of land used for a cemetery was a hectare that could not be used for housing, for offices, for the relentless economic engine that Hong Kong had built its identity on. Burial land, quite simply, became one of the most valuable and most contested resources in the territory. By the mid-20th century, Hong Kong's government had to make a decision that most nations never have to consider. Should the dead be allowed to occupy land indefinitely, while the living are crammed into smaller and smaller spaces? The answer, increasingly, was no, and that decision would permanently reshape what death itself looks like in this city. Today, if a family in Hong Kong chooses a traditional burial for a loved one, they are not purchasing land forever. They are leasing it. Public cemetery plots are typically granted for a strict period of 6 years. When that lease expires, the family is legally required to exhume the remains. Government workers, or hired specialists, open the grave, remove the skeleton, and the bones are cleaned, sometimes boiled or scrubbed by hand in a practice with roots in older Chinese secondary burial customs. The bones are then either cremated and placed into a much smaller urn or ceremonially reburied in a compact ossuary space, freeing up the original plot of earth. That plot is then reassigned, prepared, and eventually given to the next family who needs somewhere to bury their dead. This might sound shocking to Western audiences raised on the idea of a permanent, marked grave, but this system did not emerge out of disrespect for the dead. It emerged out of desperate necessity, layered on top of centuries-old Chinese traditions where the treatment of ancestral bones already carried deep spiritual meaning. In many older Chinese burial customs, particularly across southern China, secondary burial was already common. Bodies were buried once, allowed to decompose, then exhumed years later, so the bones could be cleaned and placed in a ceramic urn for a final, permanent resting place, often chosen based on feng shui principles believed to bring fortune to descendants. Hong Kong essentially took a religious and cultural practice and turned it into government policy, compressed and accelerated to fit a city with almost no spare land left to give. But 6-year leases and mandatory exhumations were only the first stage of the crisis. As Hong Kong's population continued to climb through the late 20th century, even cremated remains became a logistical nightmare. Public columbariums, towering walls of small compartments, each holding an urn, filled up almost as fast as they could be built. Waiting lists for a columbarium niche in a desirable, government-run facility could stretch for years. Families desperate to lay their relatives to rest turned to private operators, and an entire, highly profitable private death industry emerged almost overnight. Private columbarium spaces in prime locations have, at times, sold for prices that rival Hong Kong's infamous housing market, with prices for a single small niche running into the tens of thousands of dollars. This scarcity produced one of the strangest and darkest side effects of Hong Kong's land crisis: illegal columbariums. Unlicensed, often unsafe structures began appearing across the new territories, built by opportunists looking to profit from grieving families who simply could not get their loved ones' remains placed anywhere legal. Some of these illegal sites operated for years before being discovered and shut down by authorities, leaving families scrambling once again to find somewhere, anywhere, to store the ashes of the people they had lost. So how has the city tried to solve this? The Hong Kong government has poured enormous resources into finding new ways to handle its dead without requiring more land. Massive, high-rise public columbariums have been constructed, essentially apartment towers for urns, some holding well over 100,000 compartments in a single building. But even these fill up almost as fast as they open, and public opposition frequently blocks new sites, since almost nobody wants a columbarium built next to their neighborhood, driven by both feng shui concerns and simple property value fears. Faced with this bottleneck, the government has aggressively promoted alternatives that require no physical space at all. Sea burials, where cremated ashes are scattered into designated waters off Hong Kong's coast, have been heavily subsidized and encouraged through public campaigns, complete with free ferry services for grieving families. Garden burials, where ashes are scattered into small memorial gardens rather than stored in permanent structures, have also expanded. Officials have gone as far as running television and online campaigns trying to shift deeply rooted cultural attitudes, encouraging citizens to see these space-free options not as a lesser alternative, but as a modern, environmentally responsible choice. Yet cultural resistance runs deep. In traditional Chinese belief, a permanent resting place for ancestors, ideally chosen for auspicious feng shui, is tied directly to the fortune and prosperity of living descendants. Scattering ashes at sea with nothing left to visit, nothing physical to tend to during festivals like Qingming, when families traditionally sweep and maintain ancestral graves, feels to many like an abandonment of duty rather than an act of environmental progress. This tension between spiritual tradition and physical impossibility sits at the very heart of Hong Kong's death crisis. The city is, in a very real sense, running out of room to honor its own history. And this is where the story of Hong Kong's dead connects back to something much larger about the city itself. This is a territory that has never had the luxury of space. Every problem Hong Kong faces, its housing, its infrastructure, its politics, is shaped by the same brutal geography, a small strip of mountainous land, squeezed between water and steep terrain, home to millions of people who refuse to leave. The graveyard crisis is not some strange footnote in Hong Kong's story. It is the same story, told through its final resting places instead of its skyscrapers. As Hong Kong's population continues to age, and as its most crowded generations begin to reach the end of their lives in the coming decades, this crisis is projected to intensify sharply. Demographers warn that without dramatic new solutions, the shortage of burial and columbarium space could become one of the defining social pressures the city faces in the years ahead. The government continues to search for new answers. More vertical columbariums, more sea burials, even proposals for shared, communal memorial walls, listing names rather than storing physical remains. But for now, the 6-year lease remains the reality for countless families across Hong Kong. A grave is rented, not owned. A resting place is temporary, not eternal. And in a city built entirely on the relentless recycling of space, even death itself has been forced to make room for what comes next.